Island Crimes and Mysteries with Nules.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Now, before I start today's story, I just want to welcome you all back to Season 2 of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas, and I want to wish you a very happy New Year. I hope this year is your year. So let's kick it off with our first episode of 2024.
Island Crimes and Mysteries.
Today our narrative unfolds in the rural landscapes of County Tipperary, Ireland, in the year 1895. Ballyvadlea was a tiny townsland covering approximately 270 acres, with only 9 houses in this townsland and 31 people living in these 9 houses. Another legacy of the Great Famine. The population had been decimated. In these times, the air was thick with folklore, superstition and a palpable sense of the unknown. People believed in the banshee and the coach de bar, or the death coach, which would whisk you away from your mortal coil, driven by the headless horseman, after the wailing of the banshee had been heard by those closest to you, usually signalling a death imminent in the family. These superstitions, or pushogues as they were known, were stories passed down from generation to generation, and usually had an associated cautionary tale attached, and people really believed in them and feared them. To this day, some people will give a ladder a wide berth for fear of bad luck if they walked under it. Or if they put clothing on inside out, they will not change it back, as this is also considered bad luck. One such superstition was people's belief in the fairies, or the little people as they were affectionately known. Some people refer to them as leprechauns, a word favoured in the US to describe them. These fairies lived under the hawthorn trees or under moles dotted around the Irish countryside. And if you disturbed their home in any way, misfortune would follow. They were known to have mythical powers. You had good fairies like the leprechaun. They were usually shoemakers and spent their time eating, drinking, playing music, and generally making merry. And of course you had the more sinister fairy like the banshee or the puka, who had the ability to change form into such animals as bats, dogs or black horses. The puka was feared as they were said to have the ability to decimate crops and kill livestock if you got on the wrong side of them. But one of the most feared of all the fairies was the changeling, an entity that the fairies would swap out with a child or a family member, an imposter if you will. Signs that a relative had been swapped for a changeling were that they appeared sickly or were suddenly very intelligent. They were believed to be evil and cruel and would relay stories of conversations had within the household back to the fairies. They were deeply feared and people strongly believed that they existed. Some would go as far as to kill a family member if they suspected them of being a changeling. We are going to explore the unsettling and tragic story of Bridget Cleary in this episode, a woman whose fate became entwined with the supernatural beliefs of her time and ultimately led to her demise at the hands of her loved ones. In a time when whispers of the supernatural danced on the edges of reality, Bridget's life took a turn towards the inexplicable. Was it the product of fervent superstitions, a tragic misunderstanding, or something more sinister? Let's take a look. Bridget Boland Cleary was 26 years old at the time of her death on the 15th of March 1895 and married to a man named Michael Cleary. They lived in a place called Ballyvadlea in County Tipperary. At the time of her death they had been married for 8 years after meeting in Clonmel, where they both worked. Bridget was a talented dressmaker and Michael was a cooper, which was basically a craftsman who made casks, barrels and vats for breweries. They had no children. Because of their good jobs and having a higher income than a lot of their neighbours, the Clearys would have been considered well off in the community. Bridget even owned her own sewing machine for work, which would have been considered a real luxury and very unusual for the time. She also had her own hens and sold eggs to add to their income. Having survived the Great Famine, her parents, Patrick Boland and Bridget Keating, were married in 1856. Life for the couple was not easy. They lived in a mud-walled cottage in Ballyvadlea, where they raised their family in these sparse surroundings. Every day a fight for survival, no doubt. Bridget was born in 1869, and though there is little information on how many siblings she had, it is thought she had older brothers. She was the youngest in the family, and despite probably being primitive, she had received some education to afford her the skills to become a talented milliner and dressmaker. Bridget worked in her chosen career in Clonmel and became the main breadwinner for the family. After marrying Michael at the age of 18 in August 1887, the couple began married life by settling in Ballyvadlea and living with Bridget's parents. Michael was 26 at the time of their marriage, and he continued to work in Clonmel as a cooper. And despite by today's standards being considered a short journey of 26 kilometres from Ballyvadlea to Clonmel, back in the 1860s and 70s this was a very long distance indeed, taking some 8 hours to travel the 26 kilometres. So Michael would spend the working week in Clonmel and only see his wife at weekends. This was a very unusual setup for the time, and of course the local gossip mill was in full swing. But they seemed happy enough with this arrangement. Bridget wanting to be near her mother, who at the time was in poor health and would eventually pass away. This left Bridget feeling responsible for the well-being of her father. They eventually secured their own cottage in Ballyvadlea, and Michael set up his own cooperage business. He used the old family cottage as his workshop. Life was good for the Clearys at this time. Bridget was well liked in the community and known as an intelligent woman who loved her fashion. Seen often in her own creations, which wowed the locals, who could only dream of ever wearing such fancy clothing. As I said, everything was going great for the couple until a cold, wintry morning in March 1895. Bridget had been out delivering eggs to the locals, and when she returned home, she started to feel unwell. She began shivering and was unable to warm herself up, despite sitting by the warm fire. By the following day, Bridget's condition appeared to be getting worse instead of better, and when she woke up that morning, she felt so weak she could not muster up the energy to get herself out of bed. She was also complaining of a severe headache. Her father was growing concerned for his daughter, and when she still had not improved by the following day, he decided to walk the 4 miles in the driving rain to the doctor's house, a man named Dr. Crean, to ask him to come and see Bridget. Dr. Crean was slow to make that visit, and after 2 more visits, the last from Michael, Bridget's husband, begging him to come and see her, he finally made the journey on the 13th of March, which was a few days after her father's initial visit on Saturday the 11th. When he arrived at the house, Dr. Crean described finding Bridget in bed and said she was suffering from nervous excitement and a slight case of bronchitis, but could not see anything to cause any undue worry or anything to suggest she was in grave danger. He gave her some medication to take and he left. This was the one and only time Dr. Crean would see her. Bridget never said anything to cause him any concern. Father Ryan, the local parish priest, also visited on the Wednesday afternoon. He also found her in bed on his arrival and said that she did not converse with him except as a priest, and her conversation was quite coherent and intelligible. Having heard her confession, Father Ryan gave her absolution and went on his way. Neither the doctor nor the priest had any concerns when they left Bridget that day, both saying afterwards that they did not think her condition was serious. They would never have known that Michael, consumed with the superstitions of the time, was convinced there was something far more sinister at work when it came to what was actually wrong with his wife. Having grown up with the folklore, it was not a stretch for him to start to believe Bridget had been swapped with one of these fairy beings, and the real Bridget had been replaced with a changeling. She was showing some of the symptoms. She had taken ill and was very weak, unable to move her limbs, a common trait associated with a changeling. This was known as being fairy struck. Bridget was known to have been fascinated with fairy folklore and would often be seen visiting fairy sites in the area. One such local place Bridget had visited that very day she got sick was Kyle na Grana, the site of a fairy ring, while she was out delivering eggs to a cousin of her father's, a 55-year-old man named Jack Dunn. He would later visit Bridget when she was confined to bed, and noticing that Bridget did not look like herself, which was probably because she was so sick and not for any other reason. But of course we have the benefit of modern medicine and a world where we do not take superstition seriously like they did back then. Jack began to shout out on seeing Bridget, "This is not Bridget Boland," believing that the woman in the bed was not Bridget, but a changeling. He firmly believed that the real Bridget had been swapped by the fairies and the person in the bed was one of these malevolent creatures. He pleaded with Michael to act immediately, believing it was a changeling in the bed. He told Michael that if he didn't do anything, the real Bridget would be lost forever. Michael, believing what Jack was saying, decided that he needed to do something to try and rid the house of this changeling and save his wife. In the grips of this belief, he sent for a herbal concoction from a local witch doctor by the name of Dennis Gainey. He prepared the concoction, a mixture of various herbs boiled together in milk from a cow that had recently calved, which would normally have been considered not fit to drink. William Simpson and his wife, who were neighbours of the Clearys, went to visit Bridget that evening on hearing that she wasn't well. As they approached the house, they were met by Joanna Burke, a cousin of Bridget's, and her young daughter. William inquired as to the condition of Bridget, to be told by Joanna that they were giving her herbs that they had gotten from Gainey over the mountain, and that nobody would be let in for some time. The Simpsons, along with Joanna and her daughter, waited for some time outside the house, waiting to be left in to see Bridget. It was then that William said that they heard shouting coming from the house. "Take it, you bitch, you old witch, or we will burn you out." All the shutters on the windows were shut and the door was locked, until after a period the door was opened and shouts from inside saying, away she goes, could be heard. The door was then opened to let the fairies out, William Simpson would later learn. William and his wife, accompanied by Joanna and her daughter, made their way into the house, and what they witnessed left them reeling in shock. This is what he said he witnessed. Bridget, who was now seen as this malevolent changeling by most of her family members, was forced by her husband Michael and helped by Jack Dunn and 3 other male cousins named Patrick Kennedy, James Kennedy and William Kennedy, described at the time by William as big black-haired Tipperary peasants, to drink this concoction as they held her down in the bed. Michael, who was standing by the bed, shouted out for the liquid and said, "Throw it into her." While another cousin, Michael Kennedy, held the saucepan, the liquid is dashed over Bridget several times as Michael shouted, "Take it, you witch, or I'll kill you." This was all happening in the presence of her father, Patrick Boland, and other family members. Bridget struggled vainly in the bed, shouting, "Leave me alone," while a young man aged 16 named William Ahern held a candle. For all intents purposes, this scene felt like an exorcism. After administering the herbal concoction to Bridget, the men held her down for 10 minutes more, shouting, "Away with you! Come back, Bridget Boland, in the name of God." As Bridget trashed in the bed to no avail, blood-curdling screams could be heard coming from the cottage, but the men continued their chant, "Come home, Bridget Boland." They were convinced something witchy had happened to Bridget and thought the only way to rid the house of it was to torture it out of Bridget's body. As he forced Bridget to drink the herbal mixture, Michael would shout, "Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" And according to Joanna Burke, Bridget's cousin, Bridget answered twice, saying, "I am Bridget Boland, daughter of Patrick Boland, in the name of God," but refused to answer a third time. Not convinced that the malevolent entity had left, the men then lifted Bridget out of the bed in her nitress and carried her into the kitchen and over to the fire. William said as they were lifting her over, he noticed red marks on her forehead, which he would later find out were from a red-hot poker. They had used this to make her take the concoction, it would later be revealed. What poor Bridget was suffering at the hands of her family is just unbelievable. The men then held Bridget over the fire, and William said he could see that her body was resting on the bars of the grate of this lit fire, which was burning brightly. They then began to say the rosary. It was while the rosary was being recited that her husband Michael spoke to her and said that he would ask her 3 questions, and if she did not answer them correctly, they would burn her in the fire. Michael and her father Patrick then began to say her name, to which she repeated 3 times. Michael said, "Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" To which she would answer, "I am Bridget Boland, daughter of Patrick Boland, in the name of God." They were determined to get the answers out for before midnight, also known as the witching hour. This was the hour that the people believed the veil between the living and the dead was at its weakest, so they were determined to get rid of this entity before 12. After Bridget answered the questions, they were talking amongst themselves. Bridget still held over the fire. They were heard saying, "Do you think it's her in there?" "Yes," being the general consensus. Happy in the knowledge they had removed the spirit from Bridget, they removed her from the fire and returned her to bed, where another woman present changed her into a fresh nitress. Gradually, over the course of the night, people began to leave the cottage, with William Simpson, his wife, and Joanna being the last to leave at around 6 o'clock in the morning. All that was left in the house on the morning of the 15th, when they left, was Michael Cleary, Patrick Boland, and another cousin, Mary Kennedy. As the Simpsons were leaving, Michael told William he was going to get Father Ryan, as he wanted him to say a mass in the house to banish any evil spirits that had been left behind. Father Ryan was summoned to the cottage by Michael at 7 a.m. that morning to say the mass, and arrived at 8:15. He said mass in the front room where Bridget lay in the bed. Father Ryan was oblivious to what had transpired the night before and the torture that Bridget had endured. He did notice a decline in Bridget from how she had been when he had last seen her, saying she was more nervous and excited than on Wednesday. He said Michael and her father were present, as were some of the neighbours, but there was nothing to alarm him or any clue of the previous night's events. As Father Ryan left, he asked Michael had he been given Bridget the medicine that Dr. Crean had prescribed, to which Michael answered he had no faith in it. Father Ryan told him he should give it to her, but Michael said, "People may have some remedy of their own that could do more good than doctor's medicine." With this, Father Ryan left, still suspecting nothing sinister. He said if he had suspected anything, he would have refused to say mass and alerted the police. Another opportunity to save Bridget lost. William Simpson visited again that day and said Bridget was in bed. Over the course of the day, various neighbours, on hearing Bridget was so unwell, called to the cottage, but none of them suspected anything untoward. A popular lady in the community, judging by the amount of visitors she was receiving, Bridget did not say one thing to any of them about the torture she had endured the previous night. Her cousin Joanna arrived that afternoon and said Bridget was still in bed. She was very anxious and appeared afraid of everyone that went near the bed. She said at one stage Michael came up to the bed holding a canister with £20 in it. Bridget took it and tied it up, saying to her husband to mind it, as he would not know the difference until he was without it. Joanna said she appeared to be of sound mind, but was still terrified with the situation she had found herself in. Little did she know that the previous night's events would not be the end of it.
Island Crimes and Mysteries.
By 8 o'clock that evening, Michael had sent for 2 locals named Thomas Smith and David Hogan. Thomas Smith said when they arrived they found Michael Cleary, Mary Kennedy, Joanna and Patrick Boland in the room with Bridget. He said Michael was holding a bottle in his hand and spoke to his terrified wife, saying, Will you take this now that David Hogan and Tom Smith are here, in the name of the Father, Son and Holy Ghost? Tom asked Michael what was in the bottle, to which Michael replied, Holy water. Bridget agreed to take the liquid and repeated, in the name of the Father, Son and Holy Ghost, as she took it. After she had taken the liquid, Tom and David left the bedroom and went out and sat by the fire. Michael followed them out and said Bridget was going to get up and dressed as she had company in the house. She came out and sat by the fire where the group chatted, but Bridget remained very quiet. After a while, the conversation turned to pushogery, witchcraft and charms, and the men left the house at around midnight, leaving Bridget in the company of her husband Michael, her father Patrick, her Aunt Mary Kennedy, and cousins Patrick, James and William Kennedy, as well as her cousin Joanna and her young daughter. They would never see Bridget again. According to Joanna, they continued to talk about the fairies after the men left. She said as the conversation went on, Bridget grew more fearful and said to her husband, Your mother used to go with the fairies. That's why you think I have gone with them. Michael asked, Did my mother tell you that? To which Bridget replied, She did. She told me she spent 2 nights with them. Joanna then made some tea and offered Bridget a cup, but Michael interjected and said she would have to eat 3 bites of bread and jam before she could have a drop of tea. After he fed her each bit, he said, Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of the Father, Son and Holy Ghost? Bridget managed to swallow the first 2 pieces, but without anything to wash it down and in her weakened state, refused the 3rd piece. Michael then jumped from his seat, grabbed Bridget and flung her to the ground, and with his knee on her chest and one hand on her throat, forced the last piece into her mouth, shouting, Swallow it! Swallow it! Joanna tried to reason with him, saying, Mike, leave her alone, don't you see that it is Bridget? But Michael was in such a rage, he was beyond listening to anyone. He stripped Bridget of all her clothes except for a thin chemise that she was wearing. He then took a lighted stick from the fire and held it near her mouth. At this point, everyone else wanted to leave, but Michael told them that they could not leave as he had the key to the house and the door was locked and would not be opened until his wife was back. They were all crying and shouting at him to stop, but Michael seemed overtaken with this rage and was not to be reasoned with. He proceeded to take a lit tilly lamp filled with oil and threw it on Bridget. Bridget shouted out in agony. Her cousin William was overcome with weakness upon seeing his cousin burning, and he went into another room and threw up. Joanna said the whole house was full of smoke and the smell was overwhelming. She had to leave the room. After a while, Michael came into the room to retrieve a big sack bag and shouted at Joanna, Hold your tongue, Hannah. It's not Bridget I'm burning. You will see her go up the chimney soon. Her brothers William and James replied, Burn her if you like, but give us the key and let us out. He refused to let them go, but left the house himself for a while, probably searching for a place to bury his wife. Eventually Bridget's screams began to weaken and then stop, and silence enveloped the kitchen where the traumatic event had taken place. Michael shouted out, She is burned now. God knows I would never do it but for Jack Dunn. It was he who told me my wife was a fairy. Joanna looked towards the kitchen and saw Bridget lying on the floor, her face turned towards the floor and her feet turned upwards, like she had, according to Joanna, contracted while burning, before saying she was dead and burnt on that floor. They lay Bridget onto a sheet and then Michael asked her cousin Patrick Kennedy to help bury her in a temporary grave until such time as he could lay her with her mother. Patrick initially refused when asked, saying he would only go if she could be brought to the churchyard to consecrated ground, but eventually relented for fear he would be killed if he would not comply. He explained that on Michael's return to the cottage, he shouted up to the room for Patrick, saying, "Are you there, Patsy Kennedy? I'll call your name 3 times, and if you don't come to me and answer me, I'll drive the knife to the handle in through you." Patrick's mother, fearing for his life, said, "Oh, Patsy, answer him a cree, or he'll stick you." so Patrick eventually answered on the third call out from Michael. Michael told him he had to come with him, and he had the hole nearly dug, stating that as he couldn't drive the devil out through the chimney, he would drive him out through the door. He would later say that he had no act nor part in the actual burning, but was left half cracked after seeing his own first cousin burning. The area that Michael had selected to bury Bridget was a quarter of a mile from the cottage, so himself and Patrick took Bridget's remains off to be buried, returning some 2 hours later at around 5 a.m. The others remained locked in the house while they were gone. He made all the people in the house take a note not to inform anyone as to where he had buried her. He told them as he pulled a knife out from his pocket that if anyone spoke, he would drive the knife through them. They all agreed not to tell where she was buried or what had happened in the house. Michael believed them all except for Joanna. He was sceptical of her. He made her kneel along with Patrick Boland, Bridget's father, and swear not to tell what had happened. He told Joanna that she was to say that she went to prepare a drink for Bridget, and when she returned, she met her at the door. Bridget then spat in her face and went out the front door, and Joanna could not say where she went. Patrick Boland lamented, "Now that my child is burned, there is no use in saying anything about it. But God help me in the latter end of me days." Michael then began to talk about emigrating to America, before saying he would walk into Clooneen and pretend to be mad, or just do away with himself. Bridget's aunt, Mary Kennedy, exclaimed to Michael that if he were to cut every item of clothing off him, God would never allow the stains of his wife out of his clothing. But Michael said, "Oh Mary, that was not my wife. We'll go down tonight to Kilnagrana Fort and cut the ropes and we'll bring her home." Believing that his wife had been taken by the fairies on a white horse and replaced with this changeling. All they need now was the courage to go to the fort and rescue her. He began washing the trousers of the light tweed suit he was wearing, telling them that substances from Bridget's body were on the trousers. He also destroyed an earring belonging to his wife. They were not sure if Michael was faking his madness or showing real signs of madness. Did he really believe what he was saying was true? Later that day, Jack Dunn, who had not been present for the previous night's events, called to visit. Jack had participated in the events of the Thursday night where they'd held Bridget over the fire, but had no idea what transpired on the Friday night. So he was shocked to realise she was missing when he arrived that Saturday morning. Michael gave the explanation he had told Joanna to use, saying they assumed Bridget had gone with the fairies. Jack offered to help search for her, and Michael accepted this offer. They both went and searched the Kilnagrana Fort and the surrounding neighbourhood, but to no avail. Michael then started to make up stories about her meeting an Eggman about 1.5 miles away, insinuating that she may have run off with him. But eventually all the lies were getting too much for him, and maybe his conscience was starting to attack him. But after all the searching in vain, he eventually blurted out to Jack, "She was burnt last night, you vagabond." "Why did you do it?" shouted Jack. "She was not my wife. She was too fine to be my wife. She was 2 inches taller than she." Dunn told Michael to go and hand himself in to the authorities and to the priest, telling him he had no living left to do on this earth. He said he would if Dunn went with him, so Jack agreed and they both headed towards Drangan. On hearing what had taken place the previous night, Father Ryan was horrified and could not remember what he said in reply to the news. He remembers thinking, how could all of them go out of their minds simultaneously? Father Ryan went to the police and told them that he had suspected foul play, but more than that he could not say. Later that day, the sergeant met with Michael and walked back to his house with him. Michael told him that Bridget had left the house at around midnight the previous night, adding that Joanna Burke and Patrick Boland were both present at the cottage when she left. The two he had coached as to what to say when questioned. Patrick Boland was at the cottage when they arrived, and the sergeant started quizzing him. Unable to contain his emotions, he cried out, My daughter will come back to me." The sergeant left the cottage a little perplexed. Confused and wanting to get to the bottom of what was going on, he then returned to the cottage around 10 p.m. that same night and found the place all locked up and in darkness. He managed to enter the cottage through a window and started looking around. To his horror, he found a burned nitrous discarded on the ground near the open fire. Things were not adding up, and the people who had been at the cottage were still not talking. What had gone on here, and where was Bridget? Earlier that day, Joanna had been brought in by the police and regurgitated a story that she had been told to tell by Michael. Then William Simpson, the neighbour, was asked what he knew. He stated he had heard she was missing since Friday night. He had been told by Michael that she had left the home on Friday night at midnight. Michael had asked Simpson for his revolver, but he refused. He would later see Michael that evening heading to the fort carrying a big table knife in his hand. To, as Michael put it, cut the ropes and set Bridget free from the white horse. Was this a ruse to let everyone think he had gone mad to avoid the consequences of his actions? But over the next 3 nights, Michael would go to Kylenagrana Hill, supposedly believing his wife would appear on horseback from the fairy fort and he would rescue her. Needless to say, when he went to the fairy fort each night, there was no white horse and no fairies to fight, nor was there any Bridget to rescue. Did he really believe there would be? Meanwhile, over the next few days, the police continued looking for Bridget. Farmhouses were searched, ponds and rivers dredged, woods and glens as well as the local railway station were meticulously searched, but no trace of Bridget could be found. It was determined at this stage that she must be dead. But having no trace of a body meant no one could be brought to justice for her death. Arrest warrants were issued on the 20th and the police arrested Michael Cleary, Patrick Boland, Jack Dunn, the Kennedys, both mother and 3 of her sons, and William Ahern, the 16-year-old who held the candle, as well as Dennis Gainey, the man who provided the herbal concoction, hoping someone would crack and tell them exactly what had happened on the night in question. On the 21st of March, all the prisoners were brought before the magistrates' court in Clonmel and charged with the ill treatment of Bridget. They only had the stories of Joanna, which was Michael's concocted story, and the story of William Simpson at this point. That was all the prosecution had to work with. That same day, prior to the arrests, Joanna was passing by the Cleary cottage when Michael called out to her and she went up to him. He told her that he had one of Bridget's earrings. He then showed it to her. It was the gold earring that Bridget always wore in her right ear. The left one must still have been on Bridget's body. Joanna had thought Michael had disposed of them. He then told her not to be coming near the house as it was only going to be raising suspicion. Rumours were spreading like wildfire amongst the locals as to what had happened. Some petrified that the fairies had taken Bridget and worried they would be next. Then, on the 22nd of March, a breakthrough. Finally, after days of searching for Bridget's body, charred remains were found by some of the Royal Irish Constabulary police officers, a short distance uphill from the cottage, in a shallow, marshy grave, measuring approximately 3 feet in length and 2 in breadth. The remains had been covered with soil, which had been levelled with the earth and then covered with branches. The local coroner by the name of John J. Shee from Clonmel was contacted and on the 23rd of March made the journey to Ballyvadlea to carry out the inquest, which was to be conducted in a vacant house. On arrival, he found Bridget lying on a table in an outhouse, which was guarded overnight by police officers. The place was swarming with reporters and police as they all eagerly awaited the coroner's report. People wanted to know what had really happened. Had Michael gone mad and killed his wife, believing she was a changeling? And if so, how did every occupant of the cottage that night go along with him? Also, much speculation was surrounding Dennis Gainey and his concoction, and what role this had played in her death. Also that day, after the body was found, Joanna was arrested, as well as her brother William Kennedy. So at this stage, 11 people were in custody. Michael Cleary, her husband, Patrick Boland, her father, Jack Dunn, the man who initially said Bridget may be a changeling, William Ahern, the 16-year-old neighbour who held the candle, Dennis Gainey, the herb doctor, and the 4 Kennedy brothers. They were all imprisoned in Clonmel. Then in Limerick female prison were Joanna Burke and her mother Mary Kennedy. Joanna would be released within days. Meanwhile, the inquest continued, and now that Bridget's body had been found, a proper inquest could take place. The jury had been brought to the outhouse to view Bridget's body, which lay on the table wrapped in a sheet. Its appearance was described as ghastly. Her back and lower body, including the right hip and thigh, burned severely, bones and intestine protruding through the burned areas. The left lower part of her body was also burned, but not as severely. Her head and face remained intact, uninjured. The lungs were noted to be slightly congested and her spleen was ruptured. The stomach appeared healthy in appearance, indicating that Dennis Gainey's herbal concoction had not caused any damage. Her features were distorted, an indication of the suffering Bridget had endured prior to her death. After hearing all the evidence, the jury gave a verdict of death by burning, but stated that the how and the who had caused her to burn was unknown to them, as there was no definitive evidence pointing in any particular direction. After the inquest was concluded, the prisoners were again brought before the Magistrates' Court in Clonmel on Monday the 25th of March, where the evidence on the events leading up to Bridget's demise would be heard. The day prior, the parish priest, Father Ryan from Drangan, denounced Bridget's vicious death from the altar, saying he was outraged. He called for whoever knew what had happened to come forward and tell the truth to the appropriate authorities. That day, outside the courts in Clonmel, the streets were packed with people, all waiting for the prisoners to be escorted in. When they finally arrived, the crowd erupted, yelling all sorts of obscenities at them. The court proceedings got underway and the evidence began to be heard. One of those who gave evidence was the District Inspector Alfred Joseph Wansborough from Carrick-on-Shore. He had headed up the search for Bridget that culminated in her body being recovered. He had also recovered Michael's tweed grey suit from the prison in Clonmel that he had tried to clean. On the Saturday, he had supervised a search of the cottage that had resulted in the finding of some crucial evidence, including a shovel and spade, an empty oil lamp and a saucepan. On hearing the evidence, the charges of ill treatment were dropped and new charges read out in court. 8 of the men, as well as Mary Kennedy, were now charged with having on or about the 14th of March at Ballyvadlea, jointly or severely and with malice aforethought, feloniously killed and murdered Bridget Cleary. Dennis Gainey was charged with being an accessory before the fact of the commission of the crime. Joanna Burke, who had originally been arrested along with the others, had been released and was now brought back as a star witness, along with her daughter Katie. Joanna gave evidence against her own brothers, her uncle and her mother's cousin, her own cousin's husband Michael Cleary, and lastly her own mother. She spent over 4 hours giving evidence with Michael Cleary standing in the dock. At one point he shouted out that he could not listen anymore when Joanna was asked had she seen Michael throw the oil lamp over Bridget, and she replied that she did. He was told to be quiet, that he would have his turn to speak. Joanna continued her story, covering Bridget's death, the disposal of her body, and finally Michael finding the gold earring belonging to Bridget and showing it to her. They concluded their questioning of Joanna by asking her why no one present had intervened. She said it was because they were afraid they too would be burned. Each of the prisoners were asked if they wanted to question Joanna. Michael, Patrick and Gainey declined, as did the other prisoners. And with that, the star witness's testimony was over. Her daughter Katie's testimony went on in the same fashion, and with that the prisoners were remanded in custody until the following week. On Wednesday the 27th of March, Bridget's funeral was held at night in Clooneen Churchyard and attended by 4 police officers. Due to the circumstances of her death and the superstitions held by the locals, none of her family or neighbours attended. It was a stark contrast to the funeral only 2 weeks previous of nationalist shopkeeper Thomas Kickham in Mullinahone, which was attended by dignitaries and many priests. The inquest reconvened on Monday, April the 1st, where more evidence was presented over the next few days, including photographs of the cottage in the days after her murder. Michael continued to have several outbursts during the trial. As the trial came to a conclusion, Judge O'Brien addressed the jury saying, "This is the most extraordinary case demonstrated with a degree of darkness in the mind, not just of one person, but of several. A moral darkness, even religious darkness, the disclosure of which has come with surprise on many persons." And with that, the charge of murder was dropped against Michael and replaced with a charge of manslaughter. He was eventually convicted and sentenced to 20 years of penal servitude. He would spend 15 years in Maryborough Prison, now Portlaoise Prison, and was released on the 28th of April 1910. He moved to Liverpool on his release and from there emigrated to Montreal, Canada on June the 30th, 1910. His co-defendants were deemed responsible for not intervening, but the fact that they were afraid for their own mortality was taken into account. Jack Dunn, Michael Kennedy and William Kennedy were all charged with wounding. Michael being sentenced to 6 months hard labour. Jack Dunn was sentenced to 3 years of penal servitude, while William was sentenced to 18 months of hard labour. Her father Patrick was sentenced to 6 months of hard labour. Patrick Kennedy, who had helped Michael bury Bridget's body, was sentenced to 5 years of penal servitude, and his brother James to 18 months of hard labour. Their mother Mary Kennedy was released without charge due to her age and frail disposition. Charges were also dropped against William Ahern. The aftermath of Bridget's burning and subsequent death had repercussions for Home Rule in Ireland, as it was argued and debated that the superstition and credulity of rural Catholics caused concern in the ability of the Irish people to govern themselves. One writer from the time citing in his book, The Recent Witch Burning at Clonmel, that those involved in Bridget's death acted out of genuine belief that she had been possessed by a spirit, had no intention of murder, and were attempting to restore her to her rightful self. He went on to mention the enormous force which such beliefs exercise the untutored mind. This became a popular argument against Home Rule after Bridget's death. The burning of Bridget Cleary today stands as a chilling testament to a time in Ireland where social dynamics and cultural beliefs shaped Irish society during that era. Ballyvadlea, County Tipperary, like a lot of places in Ireland at the time, was a small, tight-knit community entrenched in folklore, superstition and deeply ingrained patriarchal values. Bridget's untimely demise at the hands of her own husband in the presence of so many family members reveals the latent power dynamics that prevailed in a time when women were perceived as property, subject to the whims and control of their husbands that nobody would question. The belief in changelings and fairies prevalent in Irish folklore played a significant role in fueling these irrational suspicions and the paranoia that led to Bridget's death. While the burning of Bridget Cleary shook the nation and even made news across the shores in Great Britain, it is a story of its time and a reminder to us of how far we have come as a society. Blind faith, superstition and pushogery no longer govern our beliefs. History teaches us how far we have come and how far we have yet to go. That's why it's important to remember the past. Bridget may have been described as the last witch burned in Ireland. There was even a jump rope poem some of you probably remember saying as a child. Are you a witch or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary? But at the end of the day, she was just an ordinary woman accused of something extraordinary, which ultimately cost her her life. So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.
You've been listening to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries with Nules. Join us for another episode coming real soon.